Underneath the golden mask, there was a broken boy. He died before 20. His spine twisted. His foot deformed, his body stitched together by bloodlines that should never have crossed. Buried with over 100 canes, he was too frail to walk unaided, yet crowned a god. His name was Tutankhamun, and he was never meant to survive. Centuries before him, a different ruler walked the palace halls, with elongated limbs, soft hips, and a skull stretched so unnaturally it distorted his royal portraits. His name was Akhenaten. They called him a heretic, but the truth ran deeper than faith. His body was the canvas of generations of incest, his bones echoing with mutations mistaken for divinity. And above them all, Cleopatra, the seductress, the queen, the myth. History remembers her lips and lovers, but not the 8 generations of sibling marriages that shaped her mind, her blood, her end. She was the last of her line born into a house of gods crumbling from within. For over 3,000 years, Egypt's thrones were inherited not just by sons and daughters, but by cousins, sisters, brothers, bound together by obsession with purity. Not purity of character, purity of blood. They believed they were preserving the sacred, but they were breeding disaster. In the tombs, the bones whisper. In the DNA, the truth is encoded. Spinal defects, cleft palates, club feet, epilepsy, and death before adulthood. The royal mummies are not resting. They are records of a civilization that placed myth over medicine, image over inheritance, of a kingdom that decayed not from outside conquest, but from the twisted logic within its own temples. This isn't a tale of ancient glory. It's the anatomy of collapse drawn in bone and sealed in linen. And it begins where most stories end, in the silence of the grave. Under the scorching sun of ancient Thebes, the corridors of royal palaces echoed with footsteps, not just of kings and queens, but of siblings walking down the aisle together. In Egypt's most sacred halls, a brother might take his sister as wife, and a father might offer his daughter to a half-brother, not in shame, but in solemn ceremony. These were not aberrations. They were law, decreed not by man, but by the gods themselves, or so the rulers claimed. To the Egyptians, the pharaoh was not merely a man. He was the living Horus divine, by blood born to reign with the authority of the sky god himself. His queen was more than consort. She was the embodiment of Isis, the goddess wife. And in their myth, Isis had married her brother Osiris. So too must their earthly counterparts. Myth wasn't just a belief system, it was a blueprint for the throne. Religion wasn't guidance, it was governance, and the people accepted it. How could they not? These were god kings. Their bloodline was the bridge between the heavens and the Nile. To mix that sacred blood with outsiders, priests, generals, or nobles, was unthinkable. Purity wasn't symbolic, it was literal. It flowed through arteries, was weighed in wombs, measured in lineages that stretched back to Ra himself. Any breach in that purity was a threat to the divine order, a fracture in the very fabric of Ma'at, the universal balance. So they locked their gene pool in stone temples and gold-lined tombs. Over 30 dynasties repeated the ritual, sister to brother, niece to uncle, cousin to cousin. Not for love, not even for lust, but to guard a fiction that the blood of the gods could be preserved through generations of shared wombs and recycled fathers. It wasn't devotion, it was delusion backed by power. And what power it was. Pharaohs held dominion over flood and harvest, life and death, justice and war. Their word shaped laws. Their breath summoned monuments. Their marriages shaped empires. But in sealing off the throne from the rest of humanity, they sealed a genetic tomb. What began as a religious inheritance slowly rotted into biological tragedy. Behind the opulence of Karnak and the grandeur of Luxor, mutations began to bloom in silence. This wasn't a one-time transgression. It was generational recursion. Over and over, the same blood was stirred in the same pot. Chromosomes doubled back. Recessive genes took root. Children were born broken, not by chance but by design. And no one stopped it, because to stop it would mean to question the divine right to rule. To stop it would mean admitting that gods could be flawed. The temples sang of eternity, of perfection, of immortal rulers untouched by decay. But inside the palaces, attendants learned to walk slowly beside limping princes. Royal physicians treated seizures in toddlers with crowns. Embalmers grew skilled at hiding deformities beneath linen and resin. Sculptors smoothed over twisted spines with idealized curves. What the gods had cursed men tried desperately to polish into beauty. It is easy now with science and hindsight to see the horror in it, but they saw only obedience to doctrine, to myth, to power. And in that obedience they condemned an entire lineage to decay from within. The walls of their tombs were lined with prayers for rebirth, for strength, for protection in the afterlife. But the bones buried beneath those prayers tell a different story. One of frailty of unnatural unions of a kingdom that worshipped blood until it poisoned itself. What is most terrifying is not that it happened, but that it endured for millennia. No voice strong enough, no rebel bold enough ever broke the cycle until it had already begun to collapse under its own weight. The most powerful civilization on Earth believed so fiercely in its own divinity that it willingly bred itself into extinction. And the most chilling truth of all, they did it not in secrecy but in splendor, draped in gold, wrapped in linen, crowned by gods. In the heart of Egypt's new kingdom, a king emerged who did not look like a king. His name was Akhenaten, and everything about him defied expectation. His statues rose in the temples of Amarna, unlike any pharaoh before him. Narrow shoulders, elongated limbs, wide hips, and an almost alien head stretched far beyond the skull of a typical man. His eyes were heavy-lidded, his jaw angular, his belly softly rounded. In a world that had long immortalized its rulers as muscular, idealized warriors, Akhenaten appeared fragile, distorted, almost grotesque. His portraits were not artistic interpretation. They were anatomical confessions. This was a king who commanded artisans to abandon centuries of tradition, to chisel the truth instead of illusion. And what a truth it was. Akhenaten's body bore the silent legacy of generations of inbreeding. Modern analyses suggest he may have suffered from a cocktail of rare disorders, perhaps Marfan syndrome, with its elongated features and fragile bones, Klinefelter's with its hormonal irregularities, or even a form of temporal lobe epilepsy, which could explain his vivid visions and erratic behavior. The truth cannot be pinned to one diagnosis. It was likely many at once. His DNA was not broken by accident. It was sculpted by centuries of controlled marriages between siblings. He wasn't hiding. He was declaring. In every relief and carving, Akhenaten presented himself as he was a body unraveling under divine pressure, shaped by theology more than biology. He did not flinch from his appearance. Instead, he wove it into the very fabric of statecraft. He dismantled the old gods, upended the powerful priesthoods, and established a radical monotheism. Under the sun disk, Aten. For the first time in Egyptian history, the divine was not many, it was one, and it was light. But behind that light stood a man whose body betrayed the darkness in his bloodline. His revolution was not merely theological, it was personal. The abandonment of muscular gods in favor of a glowing orb. The sudden emphasis on intimacy. The naturalistic scenes of the royal family. It was as if he was pleading for humanity in a system that had long dehumanized its rulers. But even as he reshaped the pantheon, he did not dare break the most dangerous tradition of all. He married Nefertiti, who was likely his cousin, or possibly even his sister, and together they produced 6 daughters, several of whom died young or vanished from the records entirely. The portraits of these children echo their father's peculiar features: narrow chests, bowed legs, elongated skulls. Even in this supposed age of enlightenment, the chain of inheritance remained chained to itself. Akhenaten's reign was short. His city eventually abandoned his name, nearly erased from monuments by his successors. But his body told a story too disturbing to bury. In attempting to make himself the embodiment of a new god, he had unintentionally exposed the unbearable cost of godhood. His illness was inseparable from his theology. His fragility was not a curse. It was policy shaped over centuries by the marriage of myth and governance. And when the world around him cracked under the strain of his changes, the empire recoiled not just from his religion, but from his form, from his truth. There are few things more terrifying than a civilization that will not question its beliefs, even when its kings begin to crumble in full view. Akhenaten's legacy wasn't just a brief heresy. It was a mirror held up to an empire rotting from its own principles. He did not simply break tradition, he became its consequence. Tuy đây là y phàn 3 hoàn chỉnh, đã được viết lại, với phần mở đầu thay thế đảm bảo mạch kệ liên lạc, với phần 2 giữ nguyên cảm xúc bi kịch và khớp logic xuyên suốt. His city was abandoned. His gods erased his name, nearly chiseled from history. But the damage Akhenaten left behind could not be undone with stone or decree. His revolution ended, but its consequence lived on in flesh and blood, in the body of his son. When Tutankhamun was placed on the throne, it was not the rise of a new era. It was the inheritance of collapse. The boy who wore the crown carried more than a legacy. He carried the full weight of genetic ruin, sculpted by centuries of sacred incest. He was 9. Too young to understand the empire's fractures, too frail to withstand them. His bones, soft and brittle, echoed the same mutations his father had worn so openly. But unlike Akhenaten, Tutankhamun had no vision to defend himself, no ideology to hide behind. He was the last vessel of a divine bloodline that had devoured itself from the inside out. And his body would betray that truth with every step he could barely take. Inside his tomb were more than treasures. There were clues. Over 130 walking sticks lined the chamber, worn and scratched, not decorative, not symbolic. They were necessities. Tools of survival for a boy king who could barely stand unaided. CT scans revealed a clubfoot, a twisted spine, a leg so fractured near the time of death that it likely snapped under the weight of his own body. His bones were laced with signs of genetic disorders, fragile, thin, underdeveloped. He did not grow into kingship. He grew around the limitations imposed by his blood. The royal genome had turned against itself. His mother, identified by DNA as Akhenaten's full sister, carried the same invisible signatures. Their union was never meant to create strength. It was meant to preserve mythology. But the price was irreversible. The child they produced was not just weak, he was breaking. He married Ankhesenamun, his half-sister, continuing the unbroken line of incest, as if the dynasty were incapable of deviation even as it stood on the edge of extinction. Together they conceived 2 daughters. Both were stillborn. Their tiny bodies swaddled in linen and placed beside him bore skull deformities and skeletal anomalies, the echoes of a lineage imploding. Behind the public facade, his reign was orchestrated by generals and priests eager to restore the old order. After the chaos of Amarna, the empire clung to familiar gods and rituals, using the boy as a symbol of continuity. His name meant living image of Amun, but the reality was a body failing in silence, propped up by ritual and hope. No amount of ceremony could protect him from the fractures in his own frame. His death came swiftly, likely before his 20th year. A combination of malaria, a shattered leg, and a failing immune system, any of which might have been survivable on their own, overwhelmed him together. He did not die in battle, nor in betrayal, but in the slow suffocation of a body unfit to live. Even in death, the panic was visible. His tomb was rushed, cramped, recycled from another. Coffins repurposed inscriptions, overwritten. The golden mask that came to symbolize Egypt's grandeur was perhaps not even made for him. There was no heir, no prince waiting in the wings. The family tree had withered into a stump. His death did not simply mark the end of a reign, it marked the genetic extinction of a dynasty that had ruled for centuries. In the end, there were no conquerors, no foreign enemies. The throne fell inward, undone, not by war, but by its own blood. Tutankhamun became immortal not through conquest or wisdom, but through autopsy. His tomb gave science a window into a world that broke itself by worshiping purity. His body was the last word in a dialogue that began with gods and ended with deformity. And in that silence, sealed under the desert for over 3,000 years, he waited not for resurrection, but for reckoning. Dưới đây là phần 4 đã được viết lại hoàn chỉnh, với cầu nối chặt chẽ từ phần 3, giữ đúng mạch cảm xúc, bi kịch, quyền lực, di truyền đang leo thang. Không còn là một câu chuyện rời rạc, mà là chương cuối cùng không thể tránh khỏi của một huyết thống đang mục ruộng. Tutankhamun's death should have marked the end. His tomb sealed not only a boy king, but the final bearer of Egypt's native royal blood, a line shattered by generations of sacred incest and silence. There were no heirs left, no pharaohs of divine birth waiting in the shadows. The old gods had no more sons. The Nile ran quiet, but power like blood does not vanish, it mutates. Centuries after Tutankhamun, Egypt crowned new rulers, foreign in origin, but eerily familiar in instinct. The Ptolemies, Macedonian Greeks who seized the throne after Alexander the Great, had no divine ancestry to protect. They had no mythic gods demanding bloodline purity. And yet, they embraced sibling marriage with even more zeal than the pharaohs before them. What had once been a religious mandate became political strategy taken to its most dangerous extreme. For nearly 300 years, the Ptolemaic dynasty turned their family tree into a genetic maze. Brother married sister-uncle, took niece generation after generation, not out of devotion, but desperation. They saw what happened when blood mixed with rival houses, when power slipped beyond the palace walls. So they closed the gates tighter, thinking incest would preserve control. Instead, it bred madness. By the time Cleopatra VII was born, her lineage had folded in on itself for so long that her blood was less dynasty than echo. The identities of her parents are still debated, but all roads lead to kinship. Whether the daughter of a brother-sister pair or a cousin coupling, she inherited a body shaped by centuries of closeness no biology could endure. And though history remembers her brilliance, her alliances, her beauty, her body remained a relic of the same ancient obsession with purity that had doomed her predecessors. She was raised in a palace of ghosts. Her siblings were not rivals in politics. They were threats to be eliminated or married, often both. Cleopatra co-ruled with her brothers Ptolemy XIII and Bicotona, both of whom she may have wed, both of whom she buried. Civil wars within the family were not symptoms of chaos. They were the design. The Ptolemies had locked power so tightly within their veins that it began to tear them apart from the inside. And yet, she stood above them all. Not by strength of blood, but by will. Cleopatra spoke the language of the Egyptians, charmed Rome's greatest generals, and saw what none before her dared to say aloud, that her dynasty was dying. In her relationships with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony, there may have been ambition, but there was also something older, a last desperate attempt to inject new blood into a line rotting from the root. She bore children from both men. Caesarion, son of Caesar, was hailed as the heir of two empires. Her twins with Antony, a promise of fusion between East and West. But none would escape the gravity of Rome. Caesarion was hunted down and killed by Octavian's orders. The others were taken to Rome, absorbed into politics, forgotten. Her final gamble failed. When Cleopatra died, whether by asp, dagger, or poison, she did not just end her own reign. She ended a pattern stretching back over 1,000 years. From the god-kings of Thebes to the Greco-Egyptian monarchs of Alexandria, Egypt's royal blood had been passed down through closed corridors and locked chambers. But with her, there were no more siblings to wed, no more children to claim divinity, no more masks to hide the cost. The story did not begin with Cleopatra. It began with gods marrying their sisters, with priests recording bloodlines as scripture. But it ended in her veins, a queen wrapped in silk and silver, wearing not just a crown, but the cumulative weight of every royal who refused to see the danger in their reflection. The asp may have been a symbol, but the real poison had always been inside. The end did not come with a sword or a siege. It came slowly, like the drying of a river. Egypt, once the beating heart of the ancient world, faded under the weight of something deeper than conquest, an internal erosion carved not in stone, but in blood. When Cleopatra's body was laid to rest, she was not simply the last pharaoh. She was the final breath of a civilization that had for millennia chosen power over survival. The truth had always been there, just beneath the skin. In every generation, the royal line had drawn itself tighter, binding blood to blood in a desperate attempt to preserve its divinity. But blood does not obey politics. It mutates. It remembers. And in the royal mummies wrapped, sealed, and buried with sacred spells, the evidence endured. Not curses, not myths, but the unmistakable signatures of genetic collapse. Modern science, with tools sharper than any manche and blade-saw, has sliced open these mysteries. DNA samples from royal tombs have revealed patterns that no inscription could hide: congenital defects, rare disorders, immune deficiencies, skeletal deformities. These weren't isolated tragedies. They were systemic, woven into the genome of kings and queens, whose only crime was obedience to a doctrine older than their bones. The pharaohs were not symbols of immortality. They were carriers of recessive alleles that compounded across generations. Conditions like cleft palate scoliosis, clubfoot, and cranial elongation appeared not by chance, but by design, unintended consequences of a dynasty too enclosed to evolve. The same system that built the pyramids built a biological trap from which even the gods could not escape. The temple sang of eternity, of celestial order, of divine bloodlines flowing unbroken from Ra to the throne. But that unbroken line became a closed loop, and inside that loop, diversity died. Genetic stagnation weakened not just individuals, but institutions. Rulers became more dependent on physicians, on aides, on priests to function. Decisions slowed. Power concentrated in the hands of the healthy few surrounding the sick. The illusion of godhood required more and more scaffolding to hold up its decaying core. This was not just a medical tragedy, it was a political one. As royal bodies failed, so did royal authority. Succession became a gamble inheritance, a risk. Wars of succession tore apart dynasties weakened by internal fragility. Assassinations were not just acts of ambition, they were acts of mercy, removing those too compromised to reign. And all the while, the empire around them began to fray. Invaders did not need overwhelming force. They simply needed to wait. What collapsed was not just a royal house. It was a worldview, a belief that purity was strength, that divine blood was immune to decay. But the very act of clinging to that purity ensured its downfall. Egypt fell not because it lacked resources, armies, or intellect, but because it refused to let go of a myth that had calcified into its biology. A kingdom that once measured time in millennia was undone by generations of marriages that should never have been. And yet, the dead still speak. Their bones whisper truths their scribes never dared to write. The X-rays, CT scans, and genome maps now tell a story more honest than any scroll. A story not of curses, but of choices. Not of fate, but of policy. The pharaohs did not fall from the sky. They were pulled down by a gravity of their own making, drawn inward by a spiral of loyalty to blood. Today, in climate-controlled labs and digital renderings, their legacy is no longer guarded by priests, but by scientists. Their bodies, once deified, are now data teaching modern medicine about the cost of genetic isolation. Conditions once hidden in tombs are now identified in clinics. Families at risk can be counseled. Lives can be protected. What the ancients saw as divine punishment, we now see as diagnosis. Their tragedy sealed in gold and linen has become a lesson. Not just for geneticists, but for civilizations. A warning written in DNA passed not through prophecy, but through protein. The story of Egypt's royal blood is not just ancient history. It is the anatomy of a fall. And in that fall, we find the price of believing that power must always come from within, even when everything inside is broken. Beneath the silence of tombs and the shimmer of gold, a story unfolds, not of glory, but of erosion. Egypt's royal dynasties did not vanish in a single moment of war or revolution. They unraveled slowly, painfully, one generation at a time, their undoing sealed inside the very bodies they worshipped as divine. The monuments still stand, the names still echo through time, but the blood they guarded so obsessively became their undoing. From Akhenaten's frail frame